Hello, everyone, and welcome to Celebrating Cinema. As always, I'm Elliot, your host and producer. I'm joined by Kiriko
Hello.
and Hugo.
Hey.
And we're lucky to be joined by Julian Ross.
Hello.
You'll find out who he is a bit more from Hugo's Cold Open. So here we go.
All right. In the last year of elementary school, me and some of my friends got very much obsessed by watching horror movies. Despite our young age, the goal was always to watch the scariest thing we could possibly think of. In a previous episode of Celebrating Cinema, I already talked in depth about my experiences of seeing The Exorcist around that time, but now I'd like to take you back to the first time I saw Ringu, Hideo Nakata's 1998 Japanese horror film that became somewhat of a viral hit in and outside of Japan. I was over at a friend's house for the first time ever and was very much impressed by the relative loose parenting going on, resulting in a thick stack of rented horror DVDs, and I also remember listening to Queens of the Stone Age for the first time ever there and being totally creeped out by the creaking violin that opens the first album. Then my friend's sister came in with a Cradle of Filth band t-shirt, blonde hair, black nails, and I was already totally overwhelmed and maybe a little bit in love. Anyway, we started off with a very bad alligator slasher film, and then we commenced with The Ring, a film that made a lasting impression on me. Of course, partially due to the supremely scary visuals of a young girl crawling out of a well and through the television screen into your own living room, making it one of the first horror films that also gave me the impression that I too could be harmed by the evil depicted on the screen. But something else also lingered after watching The Ring, a new region of cinema that I never encountered before in my life. Luckily, this was the time of a serious Japanese horror craze in the Netherlands. MTV broadcasted J-horror on their Asia Mania and Asian Scream late night series and later released some of these genre gems on DVD. Video rental stores were stocked with Japanese horror, and American studios were eager to remake or rip off some of the most well-known titles for a local market. It was a great time to become acquainted with the subset of Japanese cinema. Then, as a young teenage cinephile, I started going to International Film Festival Rotterdam, where Asian cinema is often properly represented, and Japanese directors like Takeshi Kitano and Takeshi Miike have a returning spot in the program. With every new festival edition, films from Japan, in my mind, became more diverse, more expensive, more wild, but also often less tied to genre expectations. It's this getting rid of a specific notion of what Japanese cinema is or should be that opened me up to even more directors, films, and periods of Japanese cinema. And I remember fondly my first time watching a Akira Kurosawa film like Seven Samurai on a way too small television set in my teenage bedroom. I also remember seeing my first films by Ozu in the local art house theater as a tribute to one of my film professors at university who tragically passed away on a way too early age. He always cried his eyes out during late spring, so we did too when we screened this Ozu film, and then Mizoguchi came after, and then Oshima, and most recently I'm totally obsessed with Ryusuke Hamaguchi, whose latest film Drive My Car, an almost transcendent adaptation of a Murakami short story, I was able to award with my film critic jury during the previous edition of the Cannes Film Festival. Camera Japan, a small but dedicated festival for contemporary Japanese cinema, will soon grace the silver screen here in Lab 111, but also in Rotterdam to offer a selection of the latest Japanese films. And looking through the program, I found another director that manages to somehow deliver on all of the things I've learned to appreciate about Japanese film. Kiyoshi Kurosawa, a wildly prolific auteur who has made some of the finest genre films next to some of the most piercing family dramas that you can imagine. The first film of Kurosawa that I saw was Pulse, in my opinion the film that Ringu could never be. A deeply disturbing look at the growing solitude in a more connected world in which the ghosts of dead, lonely people are forever stuck on the internet. It eerily anticipates the Facebook memorial pages and online suicide notes that have become a more macabre part of our social media networks. It also addresses how new media creeps literally into your life and alters your perception, sense of self, and sense of reality. It's one of the best horror films I've ever seen, not only for its visual thrills, but especially because of its melancholic and contemplative outlook on life. It's a triumph of a very diverse and prolific director who started out as a softcore porn director of pink Aiga films, climbed a bit up the ladder of prestige with detective, thriller, horror crossovers, and eventually broke through with more conceptual scares like those of Pulse. Tokyo Sonata is his ozu for the modern age, a piercing and painful social drama about poverty and shame and depression, a film that plays everything very straight, but has an undercurrent darker than most horror films could even fathom. Soon to be screened during Camera Japan is his Second World War intrigue drama Wife of a Spy, a high-budget-ish historical thriller with some fascinating twists in the dense and layered plot. It's another showcase for Kurosawa as one of the most interesting working Japanese director right now, and I think it was also a deserving win of the Best Directing Prize at the 2020 edition of the Venice Film Festival. The fun thing about returning to the same festivals, like IFFR, is discovering even more about the boundless possibilities of cinema. And I remember one year in Rotterdam where in Worm, one of my favorite venues ever, there was a night of Japanese expanded cinema, an experimental and creative approach to film projection where the projector and the screen are not unconditionally bound to each other, so that they open up the possibilities of what gets projected and what gets received by the projection. You suddenly can create audiovisual experiences in seemingly endless possibilities. And I remember a night of simultaneous overlapping projectors clashing on the big screen, the use of laser lights on top of celluloid, the use of hand fans to rhythmically block and allow parts of film to reach the screen. I remember a lot of fun and surprise and shock in the audience that I was in real time trying to figure out the inner mechanics of the form of projection they were witnessing in real time. It all amounted to a sense of radical playfulness that transcends the need for linear stories or spectatorship often associated with the medium that we all love so dearly. Here, film could literally become liberated. Today, we are joined by Julian Ross, a programmer of IFFR and a scholar in Japanese cinema with a very special focus on expanded cinema. Only yesterday he was in the Film Institute here in Amsterdam to present an event and also a book launch for his publication on Japanese expanded cinema. And today he's here with us to talk about Japanese cinema in all of its fascinating aspects. And I realized with this rambling cold open that I've made a broad overview of what we could talk about, but that's also because I don't dare to try to limit or box in what film in general and Japanese cinema in particular is or should be. Instead, I like to opt to go on a similar tour of discovery together, trying to find some of our own personal connections with the subject and try to inspire each other to discover more in the process. Julian, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
Can you maybe talk a bit about yesterday, what the book presentation was like in Amsterdam, which must be like a culmination of a long process of research and discovery?
Yeah, the book is something that I co-edited with some colleagues of mine, Go Hirasawa, a film scholar based in Tokyo, who has written on people like Masao Adachi, a political activist filmmaker, active since the 1960s and still. And also Anna Dachi-Tash, who runs this organization called Collaborative Cataloging Japan. And she and us as co-editorial board members are active in trying to identify where all these Japanese experimental films are, locate them, and lead them to preservation projects and acquisitions into museums. So in that process, we realized so much of the writing that was written by Japanese artists and critics and filmmakers at the time is just not accessible to people who don't read Japanese. Or even in Japan, these are just in archives and libraries, in journals from the 60s. So what we did was we collected all the best writing on this topic, expanded cinema, translated them, wrote little introductions, and published them in the form of a book. It was supposed to be launched last year during March 2020.
But that obscure little thing happened that nobody knows about.
I mean, the book was ready, but it was supposed to coincide with this exhibition at the MoMA of a work called Cinematic Illumination, first presented in the club, a discotheque in Japan. Yeah, with 18 light projectors. So a really special presentation that we didn't get to see because we couldn't visit the US. We also made our own exhibition of the works that we preserved in a space called Pioneer Works. But anyway, I say that because yesterday was our first official book launch.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, on a smaller scale here at the Eye and just with me. But nevertheless, it was really nice to engage in conversation with audiences here in Amsterdam about all things Japanese expanded cinema and show a few works as well.
Well, I really hope I did the subject right, because the way I described it was very much from an experiential, kind of like empiric, like how I literally experienced it when I was in Warm. And I'm wondering, like, did it make sense to you? And also, how would you describe Japanese expanded cinema yourself to an audience who has no idea what we're talking about?
I think you did a great job, actually. It's exactly, I think, these filmmakers and artists were looking to do. Basically, in the 1960s, there was a movement where artists and filmmakers wanted to explore the possibilities of cinema outside of the industrial framework of the movie theater and basically take the film projector outside of the theater space into different environments. And that meant discotheques, dance halls, small gallery spaces, and present them together with performances like dancers, multiple projectors, things like that, to really go back to the essence of the magic of cinema, the light and shadow, the projector, etc. So yeah, what you experienced in that evening, I'm really happy to hear was, that excitement that I think many of these filmmakers and artists were hoping to achieve in the experience of expanded cinema.
Well, they definitely succeeded. It also kind of reminds me, Kiriko, of the recent theater performance that you gave, which also involved the projector, right?
Yeah. In a way, it's funny that I'm by no means familiar with Japanese expanded cinema, but then for some reason it resonates, I think, with all things. I think just experiencing Japanese cinema in general, or the way you talked about it, Hugo, is because I'm no expert and because I've never studied it and never really been able to see Japanese cinema as a part that is not part of myself since I'm Japanese, it somehow all becomes your identity. And what I found so fun and also romantic about your cold open, Hugo, is that all these experiences that you had with your first Kurosawa and your first Ozu are, I think, also like very piercing moments for when I saw these films in a strange way that's the only thing that Japanese cinema could be for me. Maybe I'm going to start with an anecdote of my first time seeing Ringu.
Yes, please.
I think around the same age, I think also 11 or maybe a little bit older. It was my, I think, schoolmate who invited me to, I think in the same way as you did with your school friends, watch a scary film. And for me, I think it may have been the first, or at least the first Japanese film that I saw that I can remember. And I remember watching it and feeling very scared from this girl coming out of this TV. And then I remember that my friend who was sitting next to me at some point halfway the movie stopped looking at the screen and started looking at me and and strangely made a connection in her head that maybe should not have been made. And for some reason, I think I cut something off there.
She should have seen the Gore Verbinski remake with you instead of the Japanese original.
I mean, we should all see Ringu anyway.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
But for me, it made Japanese cinema something complicated, as many things in life become.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I remember like after Ringu, now we just went from Japanese expanded cinema back to Ringu, but we all knew that was going to be this episode. I remember that after that film, like there was such a big J-horror craze that I remember hosting like a birthday party. I was maybe 13 or something, and it was kind of like a sleepover party, and I screened Dark Water, the Japanese film, and everybody really liked it except for one kid who was not into horror at all. But it was kind of like very insensitive of me to invite, my little friends and then watch a really scary film. But it was just a moment where it felt super normal to watch these films with each other, even as young kids, because they were on TV. You could always rent them. Everybody was into them. So I don't know. It was like it was a blessed time actually to grow up, because all of those films were very memorable. But yeah, you sometimes forget that some people are really not into horror and then have like very bad nightmares.
These are things to forget
Yeah.
when you're 13.
Yeah, bad luck for them.
But what makes these films particularly memorable in terms of their horror aspect as opposed to other horror films? Is there something different or...
Well, I think what I tried to explain with Pulse maybe is that it's the horror, sure, and the visuals, but then maybe what's underneath that just goes one layer deeper into something that is deeply human and deeply disturbing. That is, like, we talked about The Exorcist in an episode, and like I mentioned James Baldwin's criticism that he was very much disappointed by that the whole of America was afraid of these films because, like, really, America, you're not, more disturbed by some of the other things in your own past? And I think maybe some of these films are more insistent in delving a bit deeper. And that's not a thing that you pick up when you're 13. Then you're like, oh, there's a creepy kid in the hallway and somebody drowned in the water tank and now the whole house is cursed and leaky and damp. Everything is just creepy, but there's something underneath it that I think you always pick up on. I'm not sure if you agree, Julian.
Yeah, totally. And maybe not to generalize, but in Japan, where I grew up, ghost tales are just kind of everyday conversations. And it's not unusual for people to totally believe in ghosts as a part of everyday reality. And the ever-presence of ghosts in the psyche, I suppose, leads to storytelling that, treats ghosts and spirits as something not fictional but real.
Yeah.
So how did you end up then stumbling on expanded Japanese
Well,
cinema?
first of all, I studied in London and studied film, not filmmaking, but film history. And this was like 10, 15 years ago, I suppose, when there was a revival of expanded cinema in the UK. So all these British artists, filmmakers who were active mainly in the early 70s were restaging their performances they did in the UK. So I was watching that, and then it was early in my research phase on Japanese experimental film, and I had this inkling that knowing some of the filmmakers and their works and the context in which these works emerged, I felt, okay, like, I think there must have been something like this in Japan. And yeah, as part of my research, I was able to go to Japan, be in contact with filmmakers and other scholars, and yeah, that opened a door to this world of expanded cinema that took place in Japan in the 1960s. And for me, I wanted to share that with, particularly at the time, my British peers and colleagues who, were watching these reenactments in the UK. So yeah, over the past 10 years or so, whenever I get the opportunity and funding, we've tried to restage these performances here in Amsterdam or in the UK or in the US, just to kind of decentralize that idea of expanded cinema or experimental film as something that just occurred in the West, Western Europe and North America. There was activity like this in the 60s in Japan, and I'm sure other parts of the world too.
For sure.
So yeah.
But it's like so ephemeral because you talk about restaging as well. So you need like the production notes and like the kind of like performance script, but you also need the right performers to do the things that they conceived back in the 60s and 70s. What's that process like of unearthing those things again?
Yeah, it's like what I imagine it's like to try to understand a crime that's happened in like a crime scene. You don't see that event taking place, but you're trying to pick up everything else to really kind of shape that event in your imagination. And so, yeah, as you say, we looked at the films in some cases, production notes, photographs, reviews by critics at the time, discussions that were taking place at the time, things like this, a lot of archival research to try and understand what the situation in which this performance took place was like, who were the audiences, these kind of questions. So, and as you say, there were ephemeral things, and I always try to acknowledge that when we were presented, like this is a restaging, it's different to how it was back then, but nevertheless, it's exciting to see today. So yeah, it's with difficulty, but a lot of pleasure to kind of restage them here today.
Is there a particular iconic example you could sort of describe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So from 1963 by a filmmaker called Takahiko Imura, and he presented this performance as part of a performance series, so there weren't other films except for his. And what he did was I believe his colleague, an artist, a performance artist, sat at the front looking away from the audience, wearing like a long sleeve black t-shirt, reading a newspaper, and he had his projector projecting the film onto his back. With projecting onto black, you don't see much. You just can't really tell what's on the film. But Takahiko Imura sat beside him and started cutting the shirt to gradually reveal the skin of the body, and that really illuminates the film. So it's like a stark contrast from like projecting onto black and then onto the body. And slowly throughout the performance, he cuts the shirt in the shape of the projection, and then the film you can see on the back. So that's one example of a performance by a Japanese artist.
I love that. Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, sounds beautiful.
And was there a community already there when you sort of went back? Was it quite easy to build a network into this and then export it to a wider community outside of Japan, or were you sort of trying to have to re-excavate all of this by yourself?
Yeah, a bit of both, actually. There was and there still is, a research community within Japan looking at experimental film and especially contemporary art of that period in the 1960s. Yeah, there was even that exhibition at the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, called Tokyo 1955 to 1970. That was like 2012. So around this time, a bit before and after, there was a lot of attention on Japanese avant-garde art and experimental films. So I definitely became part of that community. But yeah, the film research community and the art research community at the time was a little bit separate. And I think me and people like Go Hirasawa that I mentioned before, and a number of other film scholars and curators started to bridge that gap between the art world and the film world. Because at the time, in the 1960s, there was, artists working with film and vice versa. It really wasn't so separate. So it made sense. And yeah, but it just really involved going to the libraries and archives and reading all these, art journals and film journals from the time, but also looking at things like weekly magazines for, just general audiences, because these activities were actually being picked up by those as kind of crazy happenings in 60s Tokyo and discotheque activities and things. So it was kind of an exciting project where I started looking at like architecture magazines, interior design magazines, those kind of things, as much as looking at the other stuff too.
That must also give you just such a crazy images of like how they envision Tokyo and stuff to be around that time. Like it must be such a so interesting to not only limit it to cinema or art itself, but kind of get this notion of what that place was like back then.
Yeah, totally. If you're interested in that period, there's this film called Funeral Parade of Roses. Yeah, I really recommend that.
Film. Yeah.
Captures, I think, what it was like then. Not that I was there, but yeah.
But it's funny what you say about like this in reaction to the industrial kind of like quality of film that is very much tied to like the cinema projection place, because when I think about maybe some of these small developments that I also mentioned passingly in my cold open, like for instance the Pink Aiga era and how directors kind of worked in this softcore porn kind of environment and then grew up to become kind of like more, let's say, auteurist art house directors. There's this kind of like, some of these moments in Japan are quite clear cut where industrial conditions kind of shape certain directors, right? I think Kurosawa is a pretty good example of that. But did you also maybe track some of those things in Japanese history as well, of like how these conditions shaped the kind of directors that rose up?
I mean, yeah, I guess just to jump on the Pink Eiga thing, what's interesting is, I guess up until around that time in the 1960s, when also that emerges, filmmaking was for, in a sense, the elite. Film studios dominated, and to become a director at a film studio, you had to be highly educated. You had to take this entrance exam and be an assistant director for a long time before becoming a filmmaker yourself. Yeah, you won't be like young anymore at that point. And the 1960s is when that really changed. Filmmakers started making their own independent production companies. Pink Eiga companies allowed for people without that kind of elite education to make films. People like Koji Wakamatsu, who, didn't have that kind of educational background of Oshima and people like that, but really thrived in the Pinkuega environment to create, unique films within that framework of softcore porn, very political and avant-garde cinema. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's what interests me about 1960s Japanese cinema, at least, that there's this really exciting confluence of activities and ideas coming together and being explored together. You can have an environment where people like Koji Wakamatsu are in dialogue with Nagisa Oshima, and they're also in dialogue with artists at the time who not making films but presenting performances and objects as art and things like that. So yeah, it's a moment where all those things come together, and you find films like Funeral Parade of Roses where it's clearly influenced by that moment and shaped by that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw some like old Kiyoshi Kurosawa Pink Aiga films, which are also quite radical and remind me most of like almost Godard films in a sense, like how he plays with the camera lens and stuff. Like the only condition is there needs to be some nudity, but they work just as well as art films actually.
Yeah,
that's interesting. You had a story about Kurosawa as well, right? That you saw in a very early age.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's not a false memory, because I was looking it up before, and it said it was a TV movie. But I saw one of the Gakkou no Kaidan horror stories in school series of films, which are a bit like omnibus films with all horror films set in school. And yeah, the director of Ringu was part of that, but also Kiyoshi Kurosawa was. And I remember going to the cinema with my friend, allowed basically for the first time without parents, and to see these horror films in the theater, and that was one of them. We arrived like 2 hours before the screening started, expecting like a huge queue of people and not being able to go in and stuff. And obviously it was pretty empty, and yeah, we didn't have to do that. But
and you were allowed in as well.
And we were allowed in, yeah. At the time, at least, Battle Royale and maybe Eyes Wide Shut were the two films I remember having age restrictions. And otherwise, you could pretty much see anything you want. I don't think they would have let me in if I went to Pinkuega Theater, probably.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
They had amazing haunted houses. Like there was like a Ringu haunted house I remember going with my friends.
Wow.
What a
that was
dream.
really scary.
With like
but
live performers in
Yeah,
it?
yeah. Actually, yeah.
Damn.
Actually, one stopped because we were so freaked out, and it was really dark. We had to hold this like rope so we're together and things, and we were like on the floor screaming, and this guy had to tell us it's okay, everything's gonna be we're just performing to get us out of that kind of scare, because it was so extreme. We were screaming, and yeah, I think we freaked him out. Yeah, they do. Yeah, in Japan there's great haunted houses if you like that kind of stuff.
This sounds like the experience my friend had when she watched Ringu with me. It was like a live reenactment of the film. Yeah.
I'm just a real person.
Damn.
Maybe can we start at the beginning also, your experiences of growing up and the kind of films that maybe shaped a part of your cinephilia and interest, and maybe also eventually led you to experimental cinema?
Yeah, sure. So much of my upbringing in cinema, at least, was shaped by this rental video store near our house, and me and my sister and mom would go there very regularly, because when you pick 3 VHS cassettes, you got this ice lolly for free. And also my mom's a big fan of Denzel Washington, so we pretty much watched everything there with featuring Denzel Washington.
Shit, that's great.
Yeah, but I remember when I was a kid, around 10 or so, I suppose, when Battle Royale came out, and the VHS of that was available in the rental store, and it was the first film that at least I encountered that had an age restriction of 15, actually. But I convinced my mom to let us watch it. And I remember her laughing in the background at this film. I don't know why, but she was really howling while we were watching it, really scared. And yeah, that's some of my memories in Japan, at least. But I think my interest in Japanese cinema was shaped by leaving Japan, actually. when I arrived in the UK at age 14, a lot of my friends were asking me about Japanese films, and particularly one was talking to me about Takeshi Kitano, Beat Takeshi, who in Japan is better known, in fact, as a comedian, actually. Yeah, Takeshi's Castle and things. So I only knew him as a comedian, and suddenly, was told in the UK that he's also an art house filmmaker, a respected one as well. So I started watching all these films by Beat Takeshi. And his first film, I believe, is called Violent Cop. And there's this scene where some guy's getting beaten up with a baseball bat, which was shot where I used to get picked up as a child to go to kindergarten, like the bus that took us there. And that was like this kind of, it struck me because, on the one hand, I was feeling super nostalgic, of course. It's the first time I'd seen that space in a long time. But I'm watching this guy getting beaten up there. and as always, when you watch films that are shot around your area, you also kind of get fixated on
the continuity.
Exactly. You're like, huh?
What happens in the next frame?
Yeah, you're just like, no, that's not. Yeah, how did he jump from there to there? That kind of thing. So that was a nice experience watching that film with my family. It's like this violent gangster Yakuza film, but I watched it with my family thinking of other things, basically. Yeah.
I love that Takeshi's Castle also was broadcasted on Dutch TV on late night. So it was always a thing that it was like on Comedy Central actually. So when I came back as a teenager from my friends and we smoked a lot of weed or stuff, I would just come back and watch 2 hours of Takeshi's Castle. And only later also I clicked together that oh wait, but he's also an esteemed actor and director. It's crazy. But it's still one of the funniest things that you can see on TV actually. So he's one of the GOATs, definitely. What I do like to know is how you got so interested in experimental film. What was your cinephilia like, and how did you transition maybe from a more, let's say, industrial kind of classic form of cinema to something more artistically and experimentally based?
Yeah, so in London as a student, I started working at this place called Close Up. It's a video library, still is, and now a cinema. At the time not, but we used to organize film screenings at the Bethnal Green Working Men's Club. So we would set up, darken the space and set up a screen and put the seats down and do the whole thing. And that was really exciting. We showed narrative feature films there, of course, too, but occasionally we would invite filmmakers and artists to present their work. And that's where I saw Ben Russell do some projection performances. I think that was probably my first experience of expanded cinema. Jonas Mekas came and introduced a film of his, and that was a really nice party and everything. So, I was kind of struck by the films I saw, but also the community around it. I think, at least in London, there was, people you'd see again and again at these screenings and have conversations about what we just saw. It's the kind of cinema that you really want to try and unpack with people who've just seen it afterwards. So, I think that really drew me. And, just this idea that film really is an active participant in the art context as well is something that excited me as well as somebody studying film and interested in film, but also, contemporary art and art in general. So, that's how I got interested in experimental film, I think. Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah. It's so thrilling to see a film or have that experience with the audience, and that you immediately need to unpack also just the pure experiences that you don't even know how to process them. But there's so much happening that you want to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So are you still into movies then, Julian? Do you still like a plain old story?
I love cinema and all its forms, basically. I'm not just experimental film enthusiast, but I also, go to the cinema to see narrative feature films too. And I've had the pleasure of being a programmer at Film Festival Rotterdam over the past 5-6 years or so, where it's been a responsibility of mine to watch the Japanese films. So that's kept me in touch with what's going on in contemporary Japanese cinema and sparked again my interest in Japanese cinema. And I get to go back to Japan pre-COVID days at least for once a year or so to see films at the Yamagata Documentary Festival or Tokyo Film Festival and be in some ways part of a emerging Japanese film community right now, which has been really nice as well.
Because what do you notice about kind of like contemporary Japanese film? We shared some fond memories of films that were made also under very specific conditions, but is there a thing that you like that really strikes you that's happening right now, or is it too difficult to generalize and contextualize everything that's presented right now from Japan?
Yeah, I can say a few things. I think, well, first of all, let's start with the frustration.
And, why not?
And that is because, Japanese filmmaking, for the most part, there's so much of it. And for the most part, it's done by a production committee of different interested parties. And that creates this situation where, there's too many, what's the phrase? Too many chefs at the table or something?
Oh, yeah, sure.
With all their interests, talent agencies, TV stations, etc., etc. And that's created, rather flat, unexciting filmmaking
Film by
at times.
commission, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I think there's been exciting independent filmmaking, especially coming out of Japan over the years, that I've been watching a lot of contemporary Japanese cinema. And I've been excited by recently Japanese films are really discussing the theme of immigration into Japan. And I think you see that a lot in the Camera Japan's lineup this year. For example, there's the film Along the Sea by Fujimoto Akio, which is about Southeast Asian migrants working in Japan, I believe. There's this documentary called Ushiku by Ian Thomas Ashe, who gets access to migrants who are at the immigration center in Japan and gets all this footage out. Japan is famously pretty reluctant, I guess, to allow immigration, migrants into their country. It's a rich country, but compared to countries in Europe, they really don't take in as many migrants as you'd think. So, in that scenario, it's really important and powerful for these filmmakers to treat this topic of migration into Japan and take it seriously, because, it is a serious topic and Japan should be taking in more migrants, basically. Yeah. So that's one theme that I see often recently in Japanese films. Another is perhaps an exploration of like indigeneity. For example, there's a film called Ainu Mosir that Camera Japan is screening about the Ainu people, who are indigenous people in what's now known as Hokkaido, the northernmost island in Japan. So thinking of indigeneity in the Japanese context, I see often now in these films. So exciting developments.
Could you say
like
that it's kind of like maybe an attempt towards more inclusivity in the cinematic landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to attempt to raise awareness around these issues and provide a platform to discuss them as well. You see that often. And there's also filmmakers who now live in Japan and, speak Japanese and are part of the Japanese filmmaking community that make films set in Japan as well. And those are interesting to see as well. There's one film in the program this year in Camera Japan called Kontora by Ansho Shauhan. Sorry, I forget right now where he came from, but he's migrated to Japan and he's been living there for a long time. And Kontora is an amazing film that really looks straight at what it means to be Japanese and what does a Japanese identity mean. And it's a rather kind of courageous film in that sense, as somebody who originally at least came from overseas. So there's really, for me at least, that's exciting to see that there is inclusivity in the Japanese film community and an attempt at least to address these issues.
So we're talking about inclusivity on the screen. Is there anything also happening behind the screen? I think Camera Japan seems to be picking up on this.
Yeah, definitely. So I think Camera Japan and the Japanese film industry really are making an effort to present more films directed by women in recent years in a way they hadn't done as much in previous years.
They leaned very heavily on Naomi Kawase for a long time.
Exactly. There was Naomi Kawase, who's still active and has her film festival in her hometown Nara and everything. Really, active member of the film community in Japan, not just as a filmmaker but as an organizer too. But she's not taking part in Camera Japan this year, at least. There's films by Nishikawa Miwa, for example, who's made films like Dear Doctor, who has a new film called Under the Open Sky that I recommend, which features Koji Yakusho, who features in many of Kurosawa's films in the leading role as an aging Yakuza trying to kind of return to non-Yakuza life and the struggles he experiences doing so. Yeah, it's a nice drama. And there's a couple others that Camera Japan are showing. For example, there's a filmmaker called Natsuki Seta with a film called Giorama Boy, Panorama Girl. Not in this festival, but I love films by Kaori Oda, who won the inaugural Nagisa Oshima Award presented by Pia Film Festival a few years ago. I think Kiyoshi Kurosawa was on the jury, as well as Ryuichi Sakamoto. And the year afterwards, they said that nobody deserves this award that we know of, so we were not awarding it to anybody.
Wow.
Which says a lot about Kaori Oda. She's convinced she's the leading name, I think, in Japanese experimental documentary and filmmaking that's really searching for a different form of expression.
So cool.
That sounds super exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to see that.
Maybe in the future at Camera Japan or Rotterdam.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thanks, Julian, for these tips. People should look them out. And did you also see Drive My Car, the Hamaguchi film?
I've seen Drive
Did
My
you
Car.
like it?
Yeah, no, I like it a lot. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Happy Hour. I think Hamaguchi, maybe I prefer the films by him that have women protagonists than, so Drive My Car isn't my absolute favorite, but still, yeah, the way he brings in theater and kind of performance and reenactment and things like that.
And also this kind of like multilingual pan-Asian cast. Also in terms of inclusivity, there's something interesting going on there also with the disability aspect and stuff. Yeah.
Is this the Venice film you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, this is the
Okay.
film that played in Cannes, and it's a Murakami adaptation, and it's this very depressed actor, and he gets invited to this residency to do a performance of Uncle Vanya, and the whole cast is like pan-Asian, so there's somebody from Taiwan, somebody from the Philippines, somebody from South Korea who is mute, so she speaks in sign language in South Korean, and then they have to practice the performance together, but they don't understand the language, but they have the shared art, and it just kind of accumulates in this very, well, it is a very sentimental story, but it's told in a very, very accurate, I would say, layered manner that doesn't overplay its emotional hand too soon.
Oh,
It's very
nice.
beautiful.
So how does Wife of a Spy compare to these other films that you've...
Well, how does Wife of a Spy to compare to anything? I like about Kurosawa, like to go back to him, that he is so versatile and prolific, and like Pulse is still one of the like literally best horror films I've ever seen. And then, I talked about Tokyo Sonata, which is just a very, very, very heavy but beautiful drama. And Wife of a Spy is him doing kind of like a Second World War prestige film, but then also making it Kurosawa. So there's all these layers underneath it, and it's also about like the unearthing of a piece of celluloid footage that kind of like is the proof of these experiments on humans during the Second World War. And it's kind of like all these political intrigues. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening. It's a super convoluted plot, maybe also sometimes too convoluted, but that's part of the genre, I think. He's very good at, I guess, doing prestigious genre exercises, maybe.
Well, honestly speaking, it's probably one of my least favorites, at least by Kurosawa in recent years. I do really appreciate him exploring different genres in recent years. Like, he's been known internationally and locally over the past 20 years or so as a horror filmmaker. So it's exciting to see him explore different genres and play with them. Saying that, I felt, for example, Before We Vanish played also with the concept of the genre, or it had a little twist to the genres of like sci-fi, I suppose, or alien invasion, whereas I didn't see that as much in Wife of a Spy. And I also like Kurosawa when he deals with like contemporary society and contemporary Japan. So I think that's when is that his most exciting for me, at least.
Yeah,
and you don't see that with Wife
that's
of a
also why
Spy.
Tokyo Sonata is such a good film, because it's also quite relentless in showing like the problems of a contemporary society that often people shy away from. And many of the great films in general throughout the world do that, but he did that with a level of dedication that is also, I think, quite rare, because like, I don't know, a Koreeda or something always has a sweeter side to the stories. They're always kind of like bittersweet, and Tokyo Sonata just after a while takes away all the sweetness. And there's something to be said for both, but it's refreshing to have that against another famous Japanese director who works in kind of like that same contemporary.
It feels like something happened to Japanese cinema at some point, no? Like just listening to this conversation. Or maybe my knowledge of the history of Japanese cinema is not enough, but it seems like we're going to like a more sweeter and sweeter genre of film that is now becoming popular. And now, as you're saying, like slowly we're just a tiny bit delving into the themes of migration and stuff. Like it sounds as if shit was really happening in the 60s and we were really questioning the means of what cinema was, and then went into this crazy horror period, which has now become this Koreeda, solely family sweet stories that are now what Japan is now famous for.
Well, I think an educated guess as of why would be also like, it's only logical that you have like a big flourishing of, for instance, horror films when you get very cheap means of film production. So you can make films with low costs and that can reach a big number of people, and then especially tied to like video rental places and kind of like cheap cinemas, it that works. And as you said, Julian, kind of like this film by commission, you can either do, of course, two things. You can either emulate the most prestigious art house films on earth, like a Golden Palm winning Koreeda kind of film, or you go to maybe a bit more like big budget, sheen, high prestige, big audience, racking like box office hit. And then we see the same thing in the Netherlands, I guess.
That's true.
There's just this general area in between that kind of gets left behind. And then there's only a handful of directors and stories emerging that are interesting to pick up, and you wish that they would develop quicker and do more and become more free and unstrained. But that's quite difficult to. I also think that's also partially like the fault of, for instance, Europe and the West, that they pick up now only the films that they think are fitting of this profile of what a Japanese film should be, which is now highly contemplative, contemporary social relations dramas or something.
Yeah,
where
maybe.
like, yeah.
Yeah, Japan produces more films than most countries. Like, I think it's like third or fourth or something in terms of number of films every year. So in that sense, it is an industry that makes a lot, and only a small part of that makes it to, film festivals and theatrical releases in theaters over here, for example. But yeah, I agree. A lot of it's pretty sentimental. A lot of Japanese cinema is set in high school, for example. Just in general, in popular culture, the setting is often high school. And yeah, this kind of feeling of freedom that's associated with it is what you often see in Japanese cinema and also anime as well. Yeah, so I wish there was more, broader palette, I think, and there is. Independent filmmaking definitely explores other things, but the majority of what we see here is, family dramas and with a bit of a kind of sentimental nature, I think.
But yeah, Julian, at least we found some, highlights also in the Camera Japan program that's playing in Lab 111 and also in Rotterdam. So there's definitely stuff to look out for. And in the meantime, you're, of course, programming ahead for the next edition of Film Festival Rotterdam. So that will be in January 2020, stuff to also look forward to. So there's, of course, still some gems on the horizon. And I guess in the meantime, if people want to, get really into a new area of Japanese cinema, for them, they should just check out the book that you co-edited on Japanese expanded cinema. Where can they get it?
You can get it at the store and also online at the publisher's website, Archive Books.
Okay, we'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you.
And if you like the sound of any of the films mentioned that are going to be featuring at Camera Japan, you can buy tickets for that, and that'll be happening from the 29th of September to the 3rd of October. And I'd like to also announce we're doing a little competition, or a giveaway, I should say. The idea is to send us your reviews of Camera Japan Festival. You can leave them at the Apple review section or write to us at celebratingcinema@lab111.nl. And Hugo's already looking at me saying, what can you win?
What can I win?
Well, you can win one of our very own tote bags of Celebrating Cinema.
That's
I already
cute.
have that.
And you can also get 10% off on our new pizzas that we're serving out here.
I don't
at
have
Lab.
that yet. I want that.
But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. Until next episode.